Okay, welcome. I'm so glad to be here again to give you your next presentation in my series, Portraits of Famous Women in History, particularly female rulers in history. My name is Professor Richard Brabender. I am teaching now at Bridgewater State University. I've been down there since 2008, and I got my PhD at Brandeis, and I got my master's at Villanova and my BA down in Allentown, Pennsylvania at Mulberry College. So I am from New York. So my usual disclaimer is I tend to speak a little faster than you guys, and I was just down in New York the previous weekend. So if my New York accent is coming out and I'm speaking too fast or I'm not enunciating clearly, please let me know. And I also treat these as open lectures. So in other words, if you want to ask a question, I'm perfectly fine with you interrupting me and going on, or we could save the questions for the end, whichever works best for you. With that said, there's two types of historians. Those that admit their biases and those that don't. And so as usual, I like to admit my biases before we start. So obviously when we're covering Chinese history, given the recent political climate and the issues the United States has with China and the ongoing trade war, sometimes covering Chinese history can be a difficult proposition. Then we added to that fact the kind of stereotypes that we have about Chinese women in particular, or East Asian women in particular, and those type of biases as well. And so that's something I will address in addition to trying to place this topic within a wider perspective of how we understand China, its history, and its role in the world. And when I was at Brandeis, one of my mentors, Professor John Schrecker, I TA'd with him for 6 years East Asian history class. So this is a topic I'm very familiar with and enjoy discussing about. Although my dissertation is on 17th century England, which is not anywhere close to China, but as part of my teaching world history at Bridgewater, this is topics we come up a lot about. So what I want to first talk about is to place the context of the dispute that's happening between China and the United States today, just to remind us why it's so important for us as Americans to learn more about China, to understand the Chinese people and Chinese history, because it has a direct relevance on our daily lives in many ways. And so the biggest issue, of course, that exists between the United States and China today is the trade deficit. Okay? And so these are statistics from year 2018, so we don't have the most recent figures yet. But when we compare the two countries that are, by the way, the two most powerful economies in the world, so the United States and China are the two most powerful economies in the world, the trading relationship between these two countries is very complex. But the long and short of it, as you can see from this graphic here, is that we buy from China a lot more than China buys from us. Right? And so that is what is behind the nature of the trade deficit. So these figures for 2018, we imported $419 billion worth of goods from China, but we only sold $120 billion worth of American goods to China. So we buy a lot more from China than they buy from us. But China is also interesting because of its relation to our national debt, right? So our national debt as of January 2019 was $21.9 trillion, right? No pocket change there. And of the countries, the top 5 countries that have our foreign debt, China is at the top, which makes sense since China is our biggest trading partner, that they would have the most amount of our debt, $1.146 trillion. Japan is right behind with $1.091 trillion. Then these other countries might surprise you. So Brazil is an up-and-coming economy in Latin America, $313 billion. This one surprises me as well. Ireland. Why does Ireland have $287 billion of our debt? Now the reason for that is many corporations have now been putting their headquarters overseas. And so in that way can avoid paying taxes or pay lower taxes in other countries. So that explains why Ireland is in that list. And then the UK is in the top 5 at $263 billion. Obviously, population-wise, China has 1.41 billion people, while the United States has about 326 million people. So huge difference in population size. And then as far as our military is concerned, we have more advanced weaponry, but China has a larger army. So in many ways, we are competitors and on a certain level adversaries, but there's so much more to the relationship between China and the rest of the world that we shouldn't only see China through the rubric of this ongoing dispute that's in the politics and the news daily. So having said that, and reminding us why it's important to understand more about the Chinese people and China itself, let's just jump right into talking about some of the general outlines of Chinese history. And the first thing I want to do is to show you this picture here, and I might be able to show you a much more zoomed in version of this text. I don't know if you guys can see that, but can anyone guess what language that is? It's a written language. It is English, in fact, but it's written in the secretary hand that was popular in the 16th century, in the 1500s, and so it's very difficult to read. For us today to read and speak English from that time period, it's not so easy to do. You've all read Shakespeare, right? You know how Shakespeare is obviously the same language, but difficult to read, and that is a reflection of how English has evolved as a language. So if you go back 300 years, right, in the Shakespearean age, right, we can read it, but with some difficulty, and the written language is also very difficult to read. It's only in the 1600s that they start moving away from the secretary hand, and that's one of the reasons why my dissertation was on 17th century England, not 16th century, because the paleography involved in transcribing these documents is very difficult. Now, the reason why I mention that is because if we go back further in time to, let's say, the 14th century, then you're talking about Middle English, right, which is even harder to read. That's getting to Chaucer's age and those works of literature from that age. And then if you go a little bit further than that, you're talking Anglo-Saxon, which is almost, it is the same language, but very, very different and very difficult to read. So as languages go, English is about 7 or 8 centuries old, which is, in comparison to some other parts of the world, relatively young. The same is not true with China. And so China is the longest continuous civilization in the world. We can go back with historical sources, back to about, and archaeological sources, to about 2100 BCE. And that culture has been ongoing since that time period, so 4,000 years. There really is no other civilization that has lasted that long. The ancient Egyptian civilization was around the same time period, but the ancient Egyptian religion and language died out. It went extinct in the Common Era. So this is the longest continuous civilization. And the Chinese language itself is very old. So the classical Chinese language was standardized around the reign of Qin Shi Huangdi, which would be around 221 BCE, so about 2,000 years ago. And the language itself can go back to at least 3,600 years ago. So that means that if you were to stop a person on the street of Beijing today to ask them to read poetry from 221 BCE, they could read it with the same amount of difficulty you and I can read Shakespeare. But the difference is that's 2,000 years versus 300 years. So the scope of the longevity of Chinese society, its language and culture, is really without comparison in the rest of the world. So that's one important point I want to make before we go any further. China also was really at the forefront of having this idea of a meritocratic system, and that if you were to serve in government, you had to first prove that you could read and write. And so they instituted a civil service exam system where if you were to serve in government, you had to prove that you could read and write and take an exam. And that system lasted for over 1,300 years and only ended in 1905. So that enabled even peasants to, if they could learn to read, to be able to take this exam and then serve in government and move up the social ladder. So whereas other parts of the world, we don't see that level of social mobility, particularly in Europe in the Middle Ages with feudalism, there was very little social mobility at all, but we see this feature in China. There's also some other features that we see in East Asian history, some patterns here, and it's helpful for us to think of it in that way, because when you're talking about 4,000 years, it's really hard to compartmentalize all of that history. So China goes through periods of decentralized and centralized authority. In other words, sometimes you have regimes that have strong central control, and then you have other times you have regimes that have local regional control and very weak central control. And in a way, you can think of the history of the United States in that way as well, as a counterplay between federal government and state government. Sometimes in Chinese history, you have periods of unity, where China is unified under one state or one ruler, and sometimes where it's disunited into several smaller states that often compete with each other. Sometimes China is in an expansionary state, it is expanding and conquering neighboring areas. Other times it's isolated and shutting itself out from contact with the rest of the world. The role of rebellion. Many important shifts and changes in Chinese history were the result of massive popular rebellions. And I believe we might be seeing the beginnings of one with this Hong Kong protest, Whether it's going to spread to the rest of China remains to be seen. But there's a long history of regimes and dynasties being toppled by massive popular revolts. And so that's another pattern we see here in China. And then the other is the complex relation the Chinese people have to their nomadic pastoralist neighbors to the north. So as we'll talk about geography in a moment, or I can even go there right now, there are natural barriers that protect and insulate China pretty much in every direction. In the south, you have dense tropical rainforests, as in Vietnam. Here you have the Himalayan mountains, right, the highest mountain range in the world. Then you have the great deserts here in the west, and you have the Pacific Ocean in the east. So the only area where there isn't a very prominent natural barrier is the north. And of course, the solution to that was what? What was the solution that the Chinese? The Great Wall of China, of course. Yeah, so they built the Great Wall of China to keep those pastoralists out. So that's another pattern they have of sometimes conquering and sometimes being conquered by those nomadic peoples to the north, particularly the Mongols. Another thing that we often forget is that some of the most important innovations that shaped the modern world were Chinese inventions. And so of these, the three most important, in my view, is the compass, right? The magnetic compass is developed in China around the 11th century, and that revolutionizes the way people can navigate and travel great distances. It always amazes me when I try to explain to my students that there was a day before GPS, right, where you had to print off your directions or even write them on a piece of paper. And so having that compass was so important because it made long-distance travel predictable. And when long-distance travel can be predictable, that you know you're going to be able to reach your destination reliably, then it can become profitable. Gunpowder. I don't need to remind you how important that is in the rise of the West and the rise of Europe and its ability to become dominant in the world in the modern period. But that was a Chinese invention that made its way across Eurasia to Europe, thanks largely to the Mongols. And then paper technology. So long before Johann Gutenberg developed his printing press, the Chinese had adopted those practices in the 8th and 9th century, particularly printing Buddhist texts, this one right here. And they also developed paper money before anyone else as well. So those innovations also really are reminders of how important the role of China has been in not just Asian history, but world history. Now, the Chinese have a huge population, I would argue, largely because of the beneficial situation that exists in China, particularly in this area here. So this map up here shows you population density. So you can see the vast majority of people live closer to the coastline here. And this is where you have at least 50,000 rivers, freshwater rivers, including the Yangtze River, which is the third largest river in the world. And what that means then is that there's plenty of fresh water for irrigation and for farming. In the north, they tend to grow wheat and barley, similar to the American Midwest. But in the south, where it's warmer and wetter, they use hydraulic farming and grow rice with rice fields. And of course, the yield for that is very high, and that allows for the high population. Their location is also really beneficial because they have access to the fabled Silk Road, that land route that connected East Asia with the rest of Eurasia and Africa. And of course, they could get on their ships and travel into the Pacific Ocean as well. So when you think about why the Chinese had the longest civilization in the world, it has a lot to do with both their political systems, how it encouraged a meritocracy, how they had mandated that people had to actually read and write in order to serve in government, that they had these innovations, and that they had a really well-developed interior economy with a large food surplus that allowed them to have all of these attention to innovations. So that's a little bit of a background on the history of East Asia and some of the features that make China such a dynamic part of the world. So next we want to talk about the role of women in China, because I am aware that there are perceptions about this notion that East Asian women tend to be more docile or have different cultural characteristics than Western women. And as we'll see in the case of Empress Wu, those stereotypes don't make much sense, as you'll see. She's quite an interesting woman. But having said that, like the ancient Greeks and Romans, certainly this is a patriarchal society, right? So the great thinkers of East Asia, Confucius and Mencius, who are behind Confucianism, as with Plato and Aristotle, defined society as an ideal society as being a patriarchal one, right? That you have a patriarchal relationship between men and women as heaven ordained, and this was 2,000 years ago. And so in Confucianism, you have an emphasis on filial piety, or the emphasis on the family, in which the father rules over the family as the ruler rules over the country. And so Confucian texts in popular literature and other means of communication emphasize that women were supposed to be discreet, modest, and obedient to their father and elder brothers when young, to their husbands when married, and to their sons when widowed. But that description would work well for women in the West throughout this period as well, in ancient Greece, ancient Rome as well. So trying to impart 21st century values on women in the ancient world, you do that at your own peril. But having said that, I just want to draw attention to the fact that East Asian societies are no more patriarchal or less patriarchal than anything in the West. You also had issues of infanticide, that male babies were preferred over female babies, and again we find parallels in this in Western cultures as well, and that sometimes female babies would be sold into brothels or given to wealthy families. So that situation for women is important for us to consider, because then it really kind of helps us understand how significant it is that a woman like Empress Wu could rise to power in a society that is by nature very patriarchal. And as we'll see, one of the reasons why this happens is, believe it or not, because of Buddhism. Right? Now, having said that, women could transgress those Confucian ideals, and obviously part of their success was to be a part of a home, be part of a family, and that would be their means for economic survival. And there were limited options for women, including the right to divorce or to remarry if widowed, things that were much harder to do in other parts of the world, particularly Europe in this period. And there were sometimes limited opportunities for education or running a business. And we have examples of women politicians, women poets, women warriors. I'm not going to go into their stories today, but today we are going to go over Empress Wu, who lived from 624 to 705 and rules towards the end of the 8th century. Perhaps in a later segment, I have another lecture on Empress Dowager Chi-Chi, who ruled as a regent for almost 50 years towards the end of the 19th century. And so these two women, in fact, are the only two women who rise to power in Chinese history. So that makes them very unique in this regard. But this is particularly interesting that this is happening so early, right, with Empress Wu, that this is the 8th century. And it has a lot to do, as I mentioned, with this correlation with the arrival of Buddhism in China. Now, to make a little bit of a comparison here to women in the West, right? So this idea of women having more agency and becoming servants of the government or having much more roles, breaking out of the patriarchy, doesn't really start to appear until the beginnings of it is the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment intellectual movement in the 18th century in Europe, in which you see this kind of divergence of attitudes towards women with the application of science and reason to statecraft and human relations. There was a recognition that women should not be treated in the way they were typically during the Middle Ages. So there was that kind of an intellectual breakout in how women were perceived, but it really took the Industrial Revolution for this to become established in practice, because now gender stereotypes are changed. Families are becoming smaller because children are living longer. You would be more comfortable knowing that your children would survive in adulthood. And so when the size of the families gets smaller, that gives women more opportunities to do other things. And some of them participate by working in the factories of the early Industrial Revolution. But it's really only until World War I that we come full circle and women fully become functioning citizens of democracies, right? So with the need for mass society and total war in the First World War and most of the men off on the front, women started making products and commodities in the factories, and of course they demanded to have, rightfully so, the right to vote, which happens in the United States after World War I in 1919. So my whole digression here is to point out that, yes, there is this perception that women in East Asian cultures tend to be seen in having very little agency in their lives, even today, but that's really not true when you look further beneath the surface. And it's really not until the rule of Margaret I, who united Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in the Kalmar Union, that you had a significant female ruler in Europe. So in other words, China really had the first modern, or in the Common Era, ruler before we see this in Europe. Cleopatra was, as we discussed last time, was another example of this in the Egyptian case. But then she was a standout, right? And it was not until Margaret I that we see a woman in the West rise to power. By the way, today, the statistics aren't so great, right? So certain countries are ahead of the game here as far as having women serving in government. So this is coming from in 1997. Women held only more than 30% of the parliamentary seats in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Now, there are 49 countries where that barrier has been broken, but since 2015, progress has stalled or gone into reverse. And I got these statistics from the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Report. And so in the Americas, in the lower house, about 30% of women are serving in parliament. The United States specifically, I just looked it up, it's 24% as of this Congress. So one of the reasons why I got interested into this topic is we still have not come full circle about women serving in government. Of course, we haven't even had a woman president yet in the United States. So again, the long and short of it is that with this situation, we can understand the significance that a woman in the 8th century rose to power and was a ruler, a very effective ruler, but a very shrewd and Machiavellian one as well. Last thing I need to do before we actually start talking about Empress Wu is to talk about the dynasty that she's a part of, which is the Tang Dynasty. Now, when I show this slide to my students, they get all very nervous that they're going to have to memorize this. But what I tend to do here is to show the difference between, I mentioned there was a pattern, right, between decentralized and centralized regimes. So the earliest Chinese dynasties, the Shang and the Zhou dynasty, were very decentralized. In other words, the emperor or the king had very little power, and it was the regional rulers that really ran the show. Then you had a period of disorder, the Warring States periods, where you have all these little mini regional combatants or states fight each other, until China was unified for the first time in the Qin dynasty under Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 BCE. He created a very centralized form of government. Now, he was overthrown, his regime was overthrown very quickly, and so there was a pushback against that centralization. And so the Han Dynasty, which was one of the most important dynasties in Chinese history that lasts for 4 centuries, and is analogous to the Roman Empire, was a combination of both. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You have a strong executive, an emperor with a prime minister, but then you have the prefecture system, which are local regional governments that are served by civil servants who take that civil service exam, can read and write, and protect the interests of the local peoples in those provinces against any abuses from the emperor or the prime minister. So in that way, it sounds a lot to me like our federal government and state governments, right? They kind of compete and cooperate with each other, and that's the interplay of the federal and state government that gives us our unique political culture. When the Han Dynasty falls in the 3rd century, then you have another period of disorder and competition between 6 rival kingdoms. And then China's unified again under the Sui Dynasty, which is short-lived, but then we get to the Tang Dynasty, and this is where our story begins. So the Tang Dynasty is again one of these centralized monarchies where the power is very much invested in the emperor. And the Tang Dynasty, at its height of power, actually expanded far into Central Asia, even further than the borders of modern-day China. And so the Tang Dynasty lasts for about 3 centuries. The first half of it, of this dynasty, was very prosperous. Chang'an, the capital city, perhaps had over 1 million inhabitants, which would have made it probably the most populous city in the world at the time. And as you can see, they had access to the Silk Road, to further into Eurasia and trade routes there, but of course they would also use ships to trade into the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. And it's during this Tang Dynasty that it has contact with Buddhism, and Buddhist missionaries have already been sent to China during this period and before. And that's going to have an important effect because, as we'll see, Empress Wu will utilize the Buddhist worldview to help support her rationale for becoming an emperor or an empress. And lastly, again, a reflection of the very efficient nature of this government built on that civil service exam system. You have what's called the equal field system, where all Chinese peasants were assigned land in return for taxes. And they had to do a census very often to know where the people live so they can apportion the land to each of the peasants. So the long and short of it is the Tang Dynasty is a very prosperous regime. It's expanding far into Central Asia. And this is the period of time when Empress Wu is going to rise to power. Okay, so one of the things that I like to do is to mention or talk about how these figures have been portrayed in the media. And so there have been several movies about Empress Wu, and sadly, in a sense, her legacy or her interpretation has been very, very dark. You can even see just from the look on her face, right, that she's this, scowling woman. And so she was remembered both by contemporary historians, so historians of her day, and historians in the modern world as a female usurper, right, that she seized power, that she's kind of breaking down these Confucian expectations about the role of women in society. And so that portrays her in a rather dark light in certain perspectives. And so she becomes this female usurper who is both physically cruel, erotically wanton, counter and destabilizing to the Confucian hierarchy. This was a quote from a contemporary Chinese source that was describing her. With a heart like a serpent and a nature like that of a wolf, she favored evil sycophants and destroyed good and loyal officials. Going on, this contemporary source from her time period, she killed her sister, butchered her elder brothers, murdered the ruler, poisoned her mother. She's hated by gods and men alike. Right? Now, there's a...
My question is, that's
Sure.
written by a man, correct?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's a term that's been coined recently called, so we know about the glass cliff. Now there's this idea of a glass ceiling. And so when women in power leave power, they're often mocked and ridiculed as they leave office. And they'll find every reason to try to denigrate or go against their legacies and the things that they have done. And so I think that's part of what's going on here and why she's portrayed in this way. Now there are some things she does that are frankly kind of sketchy, and we'll talk about them. But in some sense, there could be a smear campaign that was initiated against her both in her time and today, right? Because there's still sensibilities in China or around the world today in which, as you mentioned, right, from patriarchal societies that women should not be engaging in this type of behavior. So there's one perception of her, being this very Machiavellian, shrewd, evil, cruel woman, right, who rose to power by any means. But then, what's the other way to denigrate women in power? To focus on what? Their sexuality, right? So it's not going to be surprising to you that films also focus on her sexuality and emphasizing that aspect of her life, that she's a seductress, right? That she's getting her way through her feminine guiles. And so in this way, this continues that long tradition we saw with Cleopatra, when we talked about last week, how she is seen as this kind of sex fiend, and she had only 2 relationships in her 18 years of power, but somehow she's seen in that kind of scandalous way. And so in this 1963 film, you can see how her sexuality is being magnified there. And that picture was from the Empress Wu from 1939. So she has been covered in Chinese cinema quite extensively, but so far not really in the West. There have been a series of miniseries made on Chinese TV. So in 1995, she was in a miniseries there. In 2008, she was in another Chinese miniseries. And sometimes what's interesting is you have Taiwan present one version of her versus mainland China. And of course, they have very different perspectives on these topics. But the most recent coverage of her is this Chinese TV series that started in 2014. And get this, it's the most expensive TV production in Chinese media history. So for some reason, the Chinese are really examining the history and the legacy of Empress Wu. And it's kind of interesting to see how that kind of plays into modern sensibilities about the role of women in China today. And so naturally, being made in China, which is ruled by the Communist Party, there's obviously censorship involved, and sometimes how this film is presented and the subject matter that's contained with it. Okay, so now that we've explored how she's been portrayed in media, let's start looking at her a little bit at parts of her life. Okay? So she is born Empress Wu Zaitan. She's born in 624, the daughter of a wealthy government official. So she already has a leg up, right? So she's not a peasant girl. She has access to books and education materials. So at an early age, she is taught to read and write. She's very intelligent and ambitious for a young girl and well educated for her time. As I mentioned, she could write. She could read poetry. write poetry, discuss history and politics, and play music. So she had all those skills before she was even 14. And that's when she was selected at the age of 14 to become a fifth-tier concubine in the year 638 for Emperor Taizong. So the Emperor of China was so impressed by her that he made her one of his concubines, and she started that at the age of 14. Right? And Taizong rapidly became very impressed with Wu. He was impressed with her beauty, her intellectual abilities, and he appointed Wu as his secretary, even at this very young age. And so at this very young stage in her life, she's constantly involved in affairs of state at all levels. Okay? And she has the ear of the emperor, as you can see here. That's extraordinary, right? That's very extraordinary for a woman to have that access to power and be involved in the same room with these decisions being made about the Tang Dynasty. So it must reflect her charisma, her connection, her way in which she was able to relate with all these men in this very patriarchal society. So her beauty was, again, very much remarked upon. By the way, this picture is from that most expensive TV production mentioned. In Taiwan, they had this scene here, and you can see, obviously, the cleavage there. In mainland China, they censored that. So you can't, this image is illegal in mainland China of her in that film production in 2014. So while she's the concubine of the emperor, she now has an affair with his son, Prince Li Zi, the son of the Emperor Taizong, who is eventually going to become the next emperor. And this is despite the fact that the son, Li Ji, is married and has his own wife, while still Emperor Taizong's concubine. So she's having an affair with both the emperor and the heir to the throne at the same time. Now, the Emperor Taizong is going to die. And typically what would happen is all the concubines of the emperor, when the emperor dies, are forced into exile and usually end up in Buddhist monasteries. Because then the next emperor comes and he has his own cohort of concubines, and so the ones from the previous emperor aren't usually allowed to stay. But she was able to avoid that fate, particularly because, of course, she's also having an affair with the son who's now the new emperor. Right? So if she was hedging her bets, that was a pretty smart move, because that prevented her from being exiled to a monastery, and she would have had to live out her life in that monastery. And so she is now first concubine of the new emperor, the son who's now become emperor, who's now Emperor Ruizong, in the year 649 at the age of 25. So in about a spate of about 10 years, 11 years, she went from being a fifth-rate concubine to the emperor to now being the first concubine of the next emperor, and then we're only getting started. Right? So her path to power is just getting started here. Now here's where some of the stories get pretty dark. And again, the situation here is how much of this is actually true versus perhaps might be a smear campaign against her. So I am not, there's some other female rulers we'll look at in this series where it's a little bit more obvious that there was some nefarious behavior here. But I'm not so sure about that. And that's one of the reasons why she's, I think, portrayed more sympathetically in these modern portrayals. But the story goes that in 654, when she's the concubine of this new emperor, she had a daughter by him, and that daughter mysteriously was found dead in her crib. Now, today that could have even been something like SIDS, we don't know. But the accusation was laid that someone had strangled that child in her crib. And of course, who would be the person that would have the most reason to strangle that child? The actual wife of the emperor, Lady Wu. So in a sense, what happens is that she, the emperor's wife, is accused of the murder, and eventually she's going to be divorced and exiled. So by having her daughter die in that way, she in fact was able to get rid of the wife.
So who do you think actually strangled?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't know if we're ever going to know the full extent of that story, because if you want to demonize her, then you would say she killed her own child to get ahead. But it's quite possible that maybe she did murder that child to get back at her. We don't know. But the supporters of the detractors of Empress Wu emphasize that she did it herself, right? So that she would, that's how far she would go to rise in power, that she would strangle her own child. But the long and short of it is that she removes Lady Wu, right? And so Lady Wang, I'm sorry, she's found guilty, and the emperor divorces her and exiles her entire family. So the biggest impediment to her further rise to power has now been removed. Again, if you believe the dark side of her or not, again, we don't know. So now that the wife is out of the way, she's now made the first wife of the emperor. But by now, the emperor himself, Ruizong, is in very ill health. He's had a series of strokes, and for the rest of his life, he's very disinterested in ruling, and perhaps is suffering from mental incapacity as a result of those strokes. So that leaves a power vacuum. Guess who's going to fill the void? So now she sees a chance that as while the emperor is disinterested and mentally incapacitated, she can basically be a shadow ruler. So she doesn't have any official title, but already by the year 660, she's effectively the emperor of China. She doesn't have the title. And she was the power behind the office and took care of the imperial business even when she was pregnant. So she was very much a part of every decision being made. Now she's a shadow emperor, if you will. Now again, later on, after she has now unlimited power, Lady Wang and Lady Zhao, her rivals, Lady Wang was the former wife, they had been exiled. Now she has them executed. Now, again, there's a story about how they were executed, but some historians have pointed out that this description really almost verbatim matches a description of an execution that took place in the Han Dynasty several centuries earlier. So is this a smear? Or is this, ascribing an earlier event in history to her to further smear her character? Or did she actually do it, right? We don't know. But the smear story goes like this, that she ordered that those two women would have their hands and feet cut off and that they were drowned in a vat of wine. Now again, if your perspective was to portray a very negative image of her, right, this story really fits that mold perfectly. So she killed her own child, she has these women, her rivals, executed in this most horrific fashion, but there's no evidence that that happened, right? They were executed, but I doubt it was in that manner.
And their children also?
Yeah, they were exiled, but the two women there, they were executed. Now she's already starting to assert herself as a ruler, even though, remember, she's a shadow ruler, right? She's not fully having control or having the title of emperor, but she's already starting to buck the patriarchy. And so one of the ways she does this is in 666, she leads a group of women to Mount Tai. And I don't know if you can see that, but that's a stairway up a mountain to a monastery at the top there. And this was a place where typically only men went. And she went there, an ancient ceremonial center, with a group of women and conducted rituals which were traditionally performed only by men. So again, she's kind of breaking down these gender stereotypes and the perceptions of women in ancient Chinese society. Now the reason why she's able to do this, I would argue, has in some ways to do with the arrival of Buddhism in China. So we're going to go into a little side note here, into a little bit of aspects of Buddhism, because it's important for us to understand how Buddhism was a rationale for her ability to become a ruler of China. So Wu, throughout her rule, utilizes Mahayana Buddhism, which is a strain of Buddhism that is very egalitarian and affords women a role in that religion, and its progressive attitude towards women, as a rationale for her status and actions. So to legitimize her rule, she circulated a document called the Great Cloud Sutra, which predicted that there would be a reincarnation of the Maitreya Buddha, who would be a female ruler who would dispel illness, worry, and disaster from the world. So the fact that she is magnifying this aspect of Buddhism in which there's a ruler coming to save the world, and this happens to be a woman, just kind of helps her a little bit solidify her support base and her power structures for her rule. So again, if you want to have a dark view of her, she's using religion to solidify her position of power. But it is true that in Mahayana Buddhism, this perspective of women being equal to men is an important consideration. So Buddhism had already been in China at this point in the 7th century for several centuries. Buddhism, as you know, is not originating in China. It's actually originating in India. And the Mauryan Empire in India in the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, so almost 500 years earlier, did send out missionaries that spread to China. And eventually, Mahayana Buddhism will reach China in the Han Dynasty around the year 100 CE. And then you have Chinese Buddhist texts being written down by 400 CE. And so the fact that these Buddhist texts were written down helped popularize Buddhism in China. And it just so happens that the Chinese were the first people to invent paper technology and book printing technology. And so now the Buddhist religion could be disseminated even further thanks to that ability to print the word. Now, Buddhism emphasizes this concept of Wu Wei, this idea of living in the here and now, that religion and philosophy should be designed not about focusing on the afterlife, but how does it make life more bearable in the here and now? And considering how chaotic the history of China was during this period, Buddhism filled a nice niche that fit the sensibilities and needs of the Chinese people. By the way, people don't worship Buddha. Buddha is seen as the man who revealed this enlightenment, but in these artworks and statues are there to remind Buddhists of his enlightenment, but people don't actually worship Buddha or worship those statues. But I would argue that the reason why Buddhism is popular in China is because it filled that niche of trying to understand how to live one's life, because Confucianism is more of a humanistic philosophy than a religion. And so Buddhism and Confucianism could exist side by side in Chinese society in a way you wouldn't see in the West. Now, before we get into even further of a digression here, right, there's two basic schools of thought in Buddhism, and I just want to emphasize Mahayana Buddhism. Right? So Theravada Buddhism you can find in Southeast Asia, whereas Mahayana Buddhism you can find in East Asia and Japan. And the big difference here is in Mahayana Buddhism, it's egalitarian. Everyone can achieve nirvana, or that enlightenment, including women. Whereas in Theravada Buddhism, it tends to be more elitist, that only a select few people can devote themselves to that kind of meditation and study to achieve that enlightenment, and women particularly are not usually seen as part of that process. You also in Mahayana Buddhism have bodhisattvas, or saints, if you will, who help people attain salvation. So it's kind of a communal quest. People help each other, and women are seen as equal. And there's a big focus on this worldly or practical concerns rather than non-worldly concerns that you find in Theravada Buddhism. And so Mahayana Buddhism you'll find typically in China, East Asia, Japan, whereas Theravada you will find in Southeast Asia. So the point I want to make is that this Mahayana Buddhist teachings and worldview is what Empress Wu uses to consolidate her power, to provide that ideological underpinning for her right to rule, because remember, this is very unusual for a woman to come to this level of power. And so she has to really go out of her way to support herself, and using Buddhism was a very smart way to do so. So by 683 CE, Emperor Gaozong, who she had married but had had that stroke and had been mentally incapacitated, and she's been kind of ruling as a shadow emperor, he dies. And so she places on the throne her first son by him, but he is pushed out of power by Wu 2 months later in favor of another son, partially because he's younger, right? And so this younger son, Emperor Ruizong, he's going to be next in line, and he's at age 12. So having a young boy allows her to control him in a way she couldn't with the older son. But he was a disappointment as well, and she decided to have further control over him by putting him under house arrest and isolated. And he's forced to abdicate by Wu in 690. Right? So another example of her harsh treatment of her, these are her own children, right, that she's doing this to. And again, so that kind of feeds into that very negative perception about her. But again, whether or not she did that because she was, really concerned about her power, or, because she just was desperate to hold on to that power, it's hard to say. But by now, with a very young boy she can control, she is now basically in full control. And so by 690, she actually can claim to rule in her own name. In fact, she's the only woman in all of Chinese history to rule in her own name, because Empress Dowager-Cixi, who ruled at the end of the 19th century right into the 20th century, she was a regent. So technically she was ruling in the name of her sons, doing kind of the same thing, holding them up in their houses under house arrest and running the state while the son is imprisoned. But now in 690, she is actually ruling in her own name. So she's actually Emperor Wu. Right? So she's not called Empress. We call her Empress in hindsight, but she is an emperor. And she really wants to completely change the whole nature of the Chinese dynasty that existed, the Tang Dynasty. And so she does this by changing the name. So she changes the name of the Chinese state from the Tang Dynasty to Zhou, which is referencing Tianzhou, which is meaning granted by heaven. So in other words, emphasizing that her rule and her right to be there is heaven ordained, right? It's building into that Mahayana Buddhist perspective. And so she proclaims herself an incarnation of the Maitreya Buddha and calls herself Empress Shenzhen, which means Holy Spirit. And so this turning to religion to buttress her power was a smart move, because that was something that could be used to solidify her power base without necessarily upsetting the patriarchal sensibilities of Confucian society. So she commissioned statues of the Maitreya Buddha in many places, and these statues had her facial features, by the way. So she had these statues made, and some of them still exist. So there's these famous statues outside Luoyang, and they're in her own image. So again, she's associating herself very closely with Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and using that as a rationale to support her power. Now, if there were anyone who was unhappy with her rule, well, she knew about it because she had a well-organized secret police force and spies at all levels of society. So again, that kind of plays into that kind of dark nature of her, the nature of her rule. But that's kind of a double standard, because all Chinese emperors had the secret police and spies as well. So just because she's a woman and she's doing it, shouldn't be any different from when the male emperors did it as well. So now that she's fully in control, even has the title of emperor, she's in a place to engage in some reforms and programs and expansion for China. Some of these she did actually even before she became having the title of emperor in 690. So one of the things she did was in 668 she organized a military expedition to Korea and reduced Korea, which had additionally been a vassal state, an independent kingdom, to a vassal state of China. And she did that before she assumed power, when she was the shadow empress, right, when the emperor had had a stroke and was unable to rule. But it was her ability to reform the government from within that was also well remembered. And so she expanded the bureaucracy as well as the civil service exam. And that was really important, because that civil service exam is kind of like the SATs and the GREs are for our society today. So if you do well on those exams, right, that can be a way for you to move up in society, get to a good college, get a good career, and so forth. And so by expanding that civil service exam system, which, by the way, having that kind of social mobility was also tied to Mahayana Buddhism. And so that's another example of how she's adjusting society and government in response to that Mahayana Buddhism, which supports her power base and also supports her ability to have a society in which people can move up in society, as she did, right? Because she started off with rather humble beginnings and then rose through the ranks to become emperor. Now, she really wanted to change everything about Chinese society and have it revolve around her, and that's one of the reasons why she has a negative perception. And so she started to even change the language, and so she started to create new Chinese characters in the written language that reflected some of her ideals, but those did not become popular, and they were removed after her reign. She also recognized how important it was for China to be engaged in trade, and this was the high point of the Tang Dynasty's power. And as you can see from that map here, if I can go back, the Silk Road passes through the deserts here and into Central and Western Asia, and now China is exporting its goods, starting that process by which China will be a major economic world power, as of course it is today. And so she's remembered for those reforms as well. So accomplishing lots of things here in her term as emperor, when she's got full control. But eventually, she's by now getting up in age. And so by 697, she is becoming more and more interested in her lovers. Right? Again, this is a double standard, right? So male emperors have sometimes hundreds, if not thousands, of concubines, but now she has these two young men she's interested in. They're called the Zhang brothers. And so she was busy having an affair with them rather than ruling China. And so that was kind of this double standard, right? That she was a female emperor with male concubines, but that was very scandalous, of course, to the patriarchal Confucian sensibilities. She also started to become increasingly paranoid that everyone was out to get her and that she was, her power was going to be threatened with a coup or assassination. And so she purges many of her own closest advisors and subjects as well. And so by 704 CE, the court officials have had enough of her outrages, and they murder those two men who were basically manipulating her in her old age. And in 705, she's forced to abdicate in favor of an exiled son, by then she's already in poor health, and she dies a year later. But in reality, she's been in power for all intents and purposes since 660, right? So she's got almost 40 years at the top of one of the most powerful societies in the world, and left a huge imprint on the Tang Dynasty and China as a whole. And yet she's not really remembered that well outside of China. Even in China, she's not, well, these TV shows have been really reigniting interest in her. But before then, she was kind of looked down upon because of the way in which she had challenged those notions of patriarchy and male dominance.
Yeah, but didn't men do the same thing?
Of course, of course. Absolutely double standards here. And what's really ironic, and again, I think a reflection of the glass ceiling, are how women in power are often much maligned after they are out of power, is we see similar what happened to Hatshepsut. Remember we talked about that Egyptian pharaoh, a woman pharaoh who, after her reign was over, all the monuments made to her and inscriptions were defaced and the writings scratched out to try to remove her literally from history. And so she had, before she died, a huge funeral complex made. It still exists. And you can see that this huge complex, her tomb was actually behind these hills here. And you would walk up this huge walkway up to her tomb. And then in front of her tomb was this huge obelisk, which was going to be filled with inscriptions talking about all of her accomplishments. I don't know if you can see, but what do you notice about that?
It's blank.
It's blank. No one did it. No one wanted to remember her or record her accomplishments. And so this memorial tablet, which stands near her tomb, was left blank and without any inscription. The only such example of an unfilled out tomb tablet for more than 2,000 years of Chinese history. I think the fact that she was a woman had a little bit to do with that, right? So, and in many ways, her reign is kind of the high point of the Tang Dynasty, because later on, the Tang Dynasty is going to suffer a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Arabs in the year 751, and then there's a huge rebellion against the Tang Dynasty in 755, and by then, the Tang Dynasty is going to go into great decline. And by the way, Buddhism is also going to be cracked down and marginalized in Chinese society towards the end of the Tang Dynasty. So this moment in time where Buddhism was prevalent in China that allowed for a woman to rise to power, that situation is now gone. And this is why it's not until the 19th century that we see another woman who's able to rise up to become a ruler in China.
So she never remarried after her husband died.
Right, no, she had a series of lovers, right? Yeah, yeah.
How old was she when she passed away?
Let's see. She's definitely, I think, in her 70s or 80s. Let's see, she's 624 to 705, so 81? My math is highly suspect.
Which was old then.
Yep.
And she was in power, and she was kind of
That's why she
gaining
kept her
power
blood
since she
running.
was 14.
Yes, yes.
So,
Well, that's all I have to say. I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you so much.
how
Hey,
many
women are in Chinese government in power now. Do you-
Oh, and now, I don't know. I don't have that figure.
It's interesting how they're releasing that movie now, so there's obviously some sort of a plan behind it.
Yeah, I think there's a growing awareness. Let's say during Mao Zedong's time, women were the vanguard of the Red Terror in the 1960s. Women were part of the local governance in the communes as well. So Communist China has made an effort to include women in all levels of government, but not at the top, right? Not quite at the top. But yeah, it's interesting how, this is also interesting that in Russia, right? So Russia has a miniseries about Catherine the Great. She's one of the other women I cover. And both China and Russia are autocracies, right? And so typically male-dominated, but they're having a fascination with these female rulers in their history. And I'm not sure what to make of that. What Putin and President Xi have to gain by focusing on these eras of history, I'm not sure.
So, was Confucianism the religion?
Confucianism is a humanistic philosophy. So the thing about in East Asia is that these philosophies and religions can exist side by side. So literally, you could be Confucian and Buddhist at the same time.
Was there, because 400s, then you had common eras after Christ.
Right.
Was Christianity making its way in?
That's a big topic, but basically, the Abrahamic religions really don't have a niche in East Asia because you have Confucianism, you have Taoism, you have Buddhism, right? All these other, then there's the popular folk religion of China, Shintoism, right? Which I think has almost 300 million adherents today. So there's lots of different philosophies and religions in East Asia. So there's really no niche for Western religions to have. Plus, the Chinese have a perspective, not so different from our own, right? That they are the center of the world, right? And so they kind of tend to look down upon different cultural traditions and different religions.
So what they would call religions, we would call philosophies more.
It's complicated. So Taoism,
A god per se, or
well, yeah. So Confucianism is not a religion at all. There's no worship of a god. Taoism is both a religion and a philosophy at the same time. That's even more complicated. But yeah, so there's many different religious elements in Chinese society, and plus the xenophobia, I think, combines to explain why Western religions don't really have a niche in that, and they still don't. Now, of course, those types of religions are cracked down by the communist government. And I don't know if you've heard about what's happening to the Uyghurs in Western China. So there's over, I heard one report, there's over 1 million Uyghur Muslims held in these detention camps, and they're going around demolishing mosques, and they're really trying to, because from the Communist Party's perspective, religion is a threat to their stranglehold over every aspect of life. It's not the religion per se, it's just that it competes with them for the attention of the people. Thank you guys. Really appreciate it.